Love is not an emotion. That is the first thing the neuroscience tells you, and it lands differently than you expect. We talk about love as a feeling, something that washes over you, something that happens to you the way weather happens to you. But when researchers put people who describe themselves as deeply, recently, madly in love inside a brain scanner and showed them photographs of the person they loved, what lit up was not the emotional centers of the brain. What lit up was the reward system, the same ancient circuitry that activates for food, for water, for cocaine. The brain of a person in love looks, on a scan, almost identical to the brain of a person with a severe addiction. Same regions, same activation patterns, same desperate, consuming need for more. Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist at Rutgers University who has spent 30 years studying the neuroscience of romantic love, puts it this way: love is a drive. It sits closer in the brain to hunger or thirst than it does to happiness or sadness. You do not feel love the way you feel content or curious. You feel love the way you feel starving. And that changes the question entirely. Because drives are old, emotions are sophisticated, layered, culturally inflected things that vary enormously across time and place. Drives are ancient. Drives are biological. Drives do not care what century you were born in. So the question is not whether ancient humans had the cultural concept of romantic love, the poetry, the rituals, the institutions we have built around it. The question is whether they had the brain. And the answer to that question is almost certainly yes. In fact, the drive may be considerably older than our species. Here is what we know with confidence. The neurochemical architecture of romantic love involves three primary systems, and all three of them predate modern humans by millions of years. The first is dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with reward, motivation, and craving. When you are newly in love, your dopamine system is operating in a state that researchers describe as hypersensitive. Small things associated with the person you love trigger disproportionately large reward responses. A text message, the sound of a voice, a piece of clothing left on a chair. The brain is not calmly processing these stimuli. It is treating them the way it treats signals that a major reward is available, flooding the system with motivation to pursue, to seek, to get closer. The second system is norepinephrine, which produces the racing heart, the inability to sleep, the loss of appetite, the obsessive thinking. The experience of being unable to stop thinking about someone is not poetic, it is neurological. The brain is literally running the person on repeat, strengthening the neural pathways associated with them the way it strengthens any pathway that seems important for survival. The third system is serotonin, or more precisely, the dramatic reduction of serotonin that accompanies early love. Studies measuring serotonin levels in people newly in love found they were comparable to the levels seen in people with obsessive-compulsive disorder. The intrusive, repetitive, unstoppable thinking about another person that characterizes early romantic love is not metaphorically similar to obsession. It is chemically similar to obsession. And none of these three systems were invented recently. They are ancient, conserved across evolution, present in species that diverged from our lineage tens of millions of years ago. But there is a second layer beneath the neurochemistry, and it is the one that makes the question about ancient humans genuinely interesting. Because dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin explain the early, consuming, slightly insane phase of new love. They do not explain the other thing, the thing that comes after, the quieter, deeper, longer-lasting attachment that researchers call pair bonding. And pair bonding has a different biology entirely. The primary chemicals involved in long-term attachment are oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin is released during physical touch, during sex, during eye contact between people who are close to each other. It produces feelings of warmth, safety, and trust. It is the same hormone released between a mother and a nursing infant. Vasopressin is associated with vigilance, protectiveness, and mate-guarding behavior. The combination of the two, in the context of a long-term relationship, produces something that looks neurologically very different from the early dopamine frenzy of new love, but is in many ways considerably more powerful. It is the state that makes someone feel like home. The state that makes the absence of a specific person feel like a physical loss. The state that makes humans grieve when they lose a partner in a way that has no equivalent in most species on Earth. And both of these systems, oxytocin and vasopressin, are ancient beyond any reasonable historical accounting. They exist in species that have been evolutionarily separate from us for 100 million years. They did not appear with civilization. They did not appear with Homo sapiens. They are part of the baseline operating system of mammalian social life, shaped by hundreds of millions of years of selection pressure toward bonding, attachment, and the survival advantages that come with both. Now here's where the story gets more complicated and more honest, because the existence of the neurochemistry does not settle the question entirely. Neurochemistry is not the same as the subjective experience of love as we understand it. A prairie vole, which is one of the most monogamous mammals on Earth and whose pair bonding system is extraordinarily similar to the human one, presumably does not lie awake at night thinking about the meaning of its attachment to its mate. It bonds, it defends, it grieves when separated, but the interior experience, if it has one, is not something we can access. The same problem applies to ancient humans, only less severely, because they were us. Anatomically, modern humans go back roughly 300,000 years. The brain architecture, the neurochemistry, the fundamental cognitive structures were in place from the beginning. A Homo sapiens living 200,000 years ago had the same dopamine system you have, the same oxytocin system, the same capacity for the same neurological events. The drive was there. Whether the experience felt like what you would call love, whether it was accompanied by anything resembling the interior richness of what we mean when we use that word, cannot be answered with certainty. But the machinery was identical, and machinery that produces a behavior in you almost certainly produced something recognizable in them. The archaeological record gives us indirect evidence that points in the same direction. Not proof of love in any direct sense. You cannot dig up a feeling, but evidence of behaviors that are very difficult to explain without some form of deep individual attachment. There is the grave at Sungheir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, in which two children were buried head-to-head, covered in thousands of hand-drilled ivory beads that would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours of labor to produce. Someone spent the equivalent of 5 years of full-time work adorning the burial of two children. That is not obligation. That is not social performance for an audience. That is grief expressed through an almost incomprehensible investment of time. There are graves across the prehistoric record in which couples appear to have been buried together, positioned facing each other, sometimes with hands that appear to have been touching. The positioning is too specific, too deliberate, too human to be accidental. Someone made a decision about how to place these people together. Someone thought it mattered that they face each other. The reason why they thought that is not accessible to us, but the thought itself is visible in the archaeology, and it points toward a world in which specific relationships between specific individuals were considered important enough to mark, to honor, and to preserve in the ground for 30,000 years. There is also the evidence from our closest living relatives. Chimpanzees and bonobos do not form the kind of long-term exclusive pair bonds that characterize human romantic love. Their mating systems are considerably more complex and variable, but they do form deep individual preferences. They do grieve specific losses. They do show behaviors that look, from the outside, like something more than generic social attachment. A chimpanzee whose long-term social partner dies will sometimes exhibit months of depressed behavior, reduced eating, social withdrawal, a quality of altered functioning that primatologists describe carefully and cautiously as resembling grief, while being clear that they cannot know the interior experience behind it. If our closest living relatives, whose emotional architecture is considerably simpler than ours, show evidence of deep individual attachment, the likelihood that early modern humans with a more complex brain, a richer social world, and more elaborate symbolic capacity experience something recognizable as romantic love is not a romantic speculation. It is a reasonable inference from the available evidence. Helen Fisher divides romantic love into 3 distinct stages, each with its own neurochemistry and its own behavioral signature. The first is lust, driven primarily by testosterone and estrogen, the basic motivational system that pushes animals towards sexual behavior. This is the most ancient of the 3 and the least specifically human. Every sexually reproducing animal on Earth has some version of it. The second is attraction, which is the dopamine and norepinephrine stage, the early consuming fixation on a specific individual. This is the stage most people mean when they say they fell in love. It is more specifically mammalian and shows up most clearly in species with more complex social and cognitive lives. The third is attachment, the oxytocin and vasopressin system that produces long-term bonding and pair maintenance. This is the stage that produces partnerships that last years, decades, lifetimes. And it is the stage, Fisher argues, that was most important for early human survival. Because human infants are helpless for longer than the infants of any other species. A child born to a pair of parents who maintained their bond long enough for the child to develop survived at dramatically higher rates than a child born to a more casual arrangement. The attachment system did not evolve because love is beautiful. It evolved because children born to attached parents lived. This is the point where the story doubles back on itself in an interesting way. Because if the attachment system evolved partly because of its survival value for offspring, that means love, in the deepest sense, is not a luxury. It is not a refinement that appeared once human life became comfortable enough to allow for it. It is a survival mechanism, one of the oldest ones we have. The ancient human who loved their partner and fought to maintain that bond, who felt their absence as a genuine wound and their presence as a genuine relief, was not being sentimental. They were running a piece of evolutionary software that helped their children survive. The tenderness was functional. The grief was adaptive. The obsessive neurochemistry of new love was selection pressure made visible, the brain insisting with everything it had that this person, this specific individual among all the others, mattered in a way that nothing else did. There is one more thing worth saying. The universality of romantic love across human cultures is one of the most striking facts in all of anthropology. William Jankowiak and Edward Fisher conducted a systematic review of ethnographic data from 166 different cultures in 1992, looking for evidence of romantic love as distinct from arranged marriage or purely social partnership. They found it in 147 of the 166. The cultures where they did not find evidence were mostly cultures where the data was insufficient, not cultures where the evidence pointed against it. Romantic love, the specific, consuming, individual-directed attachment that produces the behaviors we associate with being in love, appears to be a human universal, not a Western invention, not a modern development, not a luxury of the comfortable, something that shows up wherever humans show up, in every climate, every economy, every social structure that has ever been documented. And universals of that consistency do not appear by accident. They appear because they are doing something that matters deeply for the species that carries them. So did ancient humans fall in love. The neurochemistry was identical to yours. The brain machinery was in place from the beginning of our species and considerably before it. The archaeological record shows behaviors consistent with deep individual attachment that are very difficult to explain any other way. The cross-cultural evidence shows romantic love appearing in virtually every human society ever studied. And the evolutionary logic shows that the drive toward pair bonding was not incidental to human survival, but central to it, built into the biology of our most basic social architecture. The answer is yes. Not as a certainty, because certainty about the interior life of people who lived 100,000 years ago is not available to anyone, but as a reasonable, evidence-based, scientifically defensible yes. They fell in love. They felt its specific, consuming, slightly irrational urgency. They formed attachments to specific individuals that felt different from every other attachment in their lives. They grieved when those individuals were lost. They placed their dead facing each other in the ground and spent 10,000 hours making beads for children they could not keep. Whatever word they had for what they felt, the feeling itself was not different from yours. The drive was the same. The brain was the same. The loss was the same. The only thing that has changed is that we now have a word for it and a brain scanner that can show you exactly what it looks like from the outside. From the inside, it has always looked exactly like this.